Well, it looks like Dudley Dursley finally got what was coming to him. Who knew Harry Potter could be so brutal? Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2018 Netflix released Western anthology film, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. The Ballad of Buster Scruggs stars Tim Blake Nelson, James Franco, and Liam Neeson, and was directed by Joel and Ethan Coen. It tells 6 narratively disconnected stories, all set in the Old West, including the life of a singing outlaw, an irony-laden tale of a bank robber, and a diverse group stagecoach ride. Whew boy. Well, I should probably preface this by saying I really don't like anthology films. Unfortunately, the horror genre usually has to bear the weight of this horrible format, so at the very least, it was unique to see a Western anthology. Unique, but not worthwhile. Mix in the Coen brothers, and I was left with very low expectations, because contrary to popular opinion, I've always found their films to be pretty hit or miss. Like many anthologies, this film utilizes a gimmick to transition from one story to the next. Sometimes with anthologies, it's just a host speaking and introducing each story, like Boris Karloff does in Black Sabbath. Other times, it's a little mini story of its own, like The Kid with the Comic Book in Creepshow. Here, the gimmick is a book of short stories, each featuring a color plate that gives a hint of what's to come in the segment. It's definitely simple, but I thought that it was effective, providing a short break between each chapter of the anthology while building a little bit of anticipation in the meantime. Also, like many anthologies, this film starts with its most interesting and arguably best story. The Ballad of Buster Scruggs initially did very little to pull me in from my already expecting the worst mood. Scruggs riding around on his horse while playing guitar was such an absurd image to me that I couldn't help but think it was a parody of something. His constant fourth wall breaks only added to the absurdity of it all. But then his true nature was revealed at the first bar, and suddenly I was interested in the character. His awesome feat at the saloon was also a momentary reprise from the odd tone of the story, but only momentary, because then there was another song and dance number. The constant vacillation between cool and absurd continued right through to the end of the segment. The second segment, Near Algodones, strikes a very different tone than the first. It still has a good deal of humor, however, irony was largely chosen over absurdity this time. Although the first segment looked okay visually, I was struck by the image of the opening shot here. Really, throughout the anthology, any outdoor shot that showcased the expanses of the Old West were wonderful. This particular story provided an interesting look into audience perspective. Our view of the main character changes throughout the story, with us first rooting against him and then sympathizing with him. The whole thing is really an exploration of fate with a heavy dose of irony and a fitting end. Continuing with the trend, the third story, Meal Ticket, strikes an even more different tone than either of the two previous segments. This is the first of the stories without humor, and that, combined with its dull color palette and mostly nighttime scenes, makes for an especially somber watch. While it wasn't my favorite segment, I would argue it was the most emotionally impactful of the bunch, especially with its haunting final image. Contrasting the dullness of the images in the previous segment, All Gold Canyon opens with bright, vibrantly colored shots showcasing a splendid nature scene, complete with a deer drinking from a crystal clear stream. Unfortunately, the story is in opposition to the images, being fairly dull and monotonous until the final few minutes. Oddly enough, this might be the segment that features one of the best story outcomes. It's just too bad it takes so long to get to it. The anthology really begins to lose steam by the time we hit the 5th segment, The Gal Who Got Rattled. Of all of the stories, this is the one with the most developed plot and also the one that takes the longest to set up. The character introductions and plot background are a bit inconsequential to the story, which makes the time it takes to get through them really drag. The final confrontation is worth powering through the dull first half, though. I also found this segment to have the best ending of all the stories in the anthology, but I'm one of the weird people who love the ending to The Mist, so take that opinion with a grain of salt. Last and certainly least was the sixth segment, The Mortal Remains. What a terrible wrap up to a subpar anthology. If you thought the previous two segments were slow, just you wait. This is an extremely dull, dialogue heavy tale that thinks it has something meaningful to say about life, but is really just a rambling mess of exaggerated self worth. Even the dark humor towards the end isn't enough to save this one. A terrible ending story, but I suppose a fitting one for this disappointment of a film. I already kinda just went through each of the segments, so I'm not gonna give a ton more input on them individually, but I did want to quickly give you my personal ranking of them. Number one for me was The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, followed by Near Algodones, Meal Ticket, The Gal Who Got Rattled, All Gold Canyon, and then finally The Mortal Remains. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The only real pro I found with this film was that it was well shot and had fairly nice cinematography. Most of the scenes look pretty good. I found the outdoor scenes, especially during Near Algodones and All Gold Canyon, to be the most visually striking. Even Meal Ticket, despite its primarily nighttime setting, looked good and contributed to the atmosphere of the story. Indoor scenes weren't quite as visually pleasing, but none were actually bad looking. As far as the cons go, my biggest issue has gotta be the anthology format. Just in general, I really don't like the style. I get that anthologies are sometimes the only way to get short films and short stories out there and seen, but I really don't like the idea of anthologies being passed off as feature-length films, rather than the collection of individual and unrelated short films that they actually are. This is especially irritating in the case of Buster Scruggs, because all of the segments in the anthology were directed by the same people. That situation doesn't happen very often, so I wish they had taken the opportunity to narratively connect the stories together somehow, even if that only meant having a secondary or background character crossing over or making a reference to a character from another segment. Con number two ties into the first, but it's the fact that the tone of this film is all over the place and incredibly inconsistent. Typically, anthologies with unrelated stories try to keep the segments connected by a broader theme or tone, but that's just not the case here. Each segment has a vastly different tone to it, and maybe that could work if there was some other connection between the stories, but this just makes the movie feel even more choppy. The third con is also fairly subjective, but on a whole, I found this film to be dull as hell. Some segments were decently entertaining. The Ballad of Buster Scruggs and Near Algodones were both fairly interesting. Meal Ticket was repetitive and dragged at times, but still managed to hook me. But after that, things took a massive dive into dullness. All Gold Canyon and The Gal Who Got Rattled were very slow and boring, with the exception of their endings. And as for The Mortal Remains, nothing about that segment was interesting to me. It was incredibly dull and dragged on far, far too long. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying any of the films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm going to give The Ballad of Buster Scruggs 2 out of 5 paws. There were a few moments that I enjoyed, but I found this film to be wholly disappointing. I would recommend The Ballad of Buster Scruggs really only to people who like the anthology format in general, or people who are Coen brothers completionists. If you like their movies, then there will be moments in this film that you enjoy, and you'll find tonal similarities between these segments and their other films, but I'm not convinced that every fan of the Coen brothers will like this movie. If you liked The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, I would recommend that you check out some other westerns by the Coen brothers, like No Country for Old Men and their remake of True Grit. Both of those films are far superior to this one, so you'll probably enjoy them quite a bit. Even the Coens directed non-western Oh Brother Where Art Thou would likely be up your alley too. If you're in the mood for an anthology that actually attempts to connect its segments, check out Cloud Atlas for an ambitiously structured story. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen The Ballad of Buster Scruggs? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, anthology films. Yay or nay? What's your favorite anthology? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insider information on this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe or get at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa, with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.